بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. Last week we spoke about the fall of the city of Akka and how Richard the Lionheart, who was the king of England and the leader of the Crusaders, was able to conquer the city of Akka from the Muslims in the year 587 of the Hijrah, which corresponds to the year 1191 in the Gregorian calendar. After the fall of Akka, Salahuddin, he reiterated his call to the Muslims for jihad. He called out to the different Muslim kingdoms to send soldiers to support his resistance against the Crusaders. Salahuddin and his army, they were greatly outnumbered by the Christian forces. The Christian forces within Sham and the Christian forces that came as support from Europe. So Salahuddin and his army were greatly outnumbered, so he called out to the different Muslim kingdoms in the land, asking them to send help and to send support. So the leader of the Turkmen Muslims, he promised that he would send some support, but it would take time. Now in the meantime, Richard the Lionheart is moving on and continuing his crusade. He moved forwards after conquering Akka. He moved forward with his sights on conquering more cities. So first, after Akka, he headed towards the city of Haifa. And Salahuddin's forces tried to stop his army, tried to stop the army of Richard the Lionheart from conquering Haifa, but they were unable to prevent them from conquering the city. So they conquered Akka, and then shortly after they conquered the city of Haifa. And Haifa was easier to conquer than Akka because it was not as strongly fortified as Akka. So it was relatively easy for Richard's forces to take over Haifa. So they have Akka. Now they took over Haifa as well. Then they went towards Caesarea. That's another coastal city. All of these cities, by the way, Akka, Haifa, Caesarea, they are all coastal cities. Cities on the coast of Palestine with the Mediterranean Sea. So after Haifa, they headed towards Caesarea. Again, Salahuddin's forces tried to prevent them, but again, they were unable to stop them from conquering the city. So they conquered Akka, then Haifa, then Caesarea. And Salahuddin and his army, they're trying their best to resist, and they put out their best effort, but in the end, they were just so greatly outnumbered that they could not prevent the fall of these cities. But they were able to inflict heavy casualties and a lot of damage on the Crusader army. And during these skirmishes, even Richard the Lionheart himself was injured. So even though Salahuddin was not able to stop Richard the Lionheart's army from conquering the cities, he was able to inflict a good amount of damage upon them. So because of this, because Richard was not able to move as fast as he had hoped he could, he thought he would just conquer city after city after city in quick succession. But the reality was that it was taking much longer than he had expected. It was taking much longer than he had expected, and the casualties that his army was suffering was more than he expected as well. So because of all of this, Richard the Lionheart decided to request negotiations with Salahuddin. So Salahuddin agreed. He thought, okay, if I'm on the negotiating table with him, then this would buy time. This would at least buy some time while I wait for my reinforcements to come. The Turkmen, they have promised that they would send soldiers, and some others, they had said that they would send support as well. They said, okay, at least let me buy some time, and during this time of negotiation, we can wait for our support and our reinforcements to come in. So Salahuddin, for these negotiations, he delegated his brother Adil to meet with Richard and negotiate on his behalf. So the negotiations actually took place between Richard the Lionheart and Adil, the brother of Salahuddin Ayyubi, who Salahuddin had sent in his place for these negotiations. Now by the time that these negotiations started, as we mentioned, Richard the Lionheart had already conquered 3 cities, 3 of these coastal cities. Akka, Haifa, and Caesarea. Now, while the negotiations were going on, Richard's army continued towards the city of Arsuf, another coastal city. Right? So while the negotiations were going on, the army of Richard the Lionheart did not stop in the crusade. They were continuing on, and they marched towards the city of Arsuf. So Salahuddin became aware that Richard the Lionheart, his forces are moving towards Arsuf. So he sent his army to try to prevent them from taking over Arsuf. Salahuddin sent his army to try to stop them. And a great battle ensued between the forces of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi and the forces of Richard the Lionheart, in a battle that became known as the Battle of Arsuf. And sadly, at the end of this battle, a large portion of the army of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi was decimated in this battle. He lost a good chunk of his army in this battle, and the Crusaders were able to conquer the city of Arsuf. So after conquering Arsuf, then the Crusaders, they moved on to the city of Jaffa. They conquered Jaffa, and after conquering Jaffa, then Richard the Lionheart, he made an announcement. He said, now the time has come for us to take back Jerusalem. Now the time has come for us to take back Al-Quds. So Salahuddin, when he came to know this, that now Richard, he had conquered much of the coastal cities. Now he's heading towards Quds. And that was the main goal of the crusade in the first place. The main objective was to take Jerusalem, right? So now Richard the Lionheart made it clear that his intention is to head towards Jerusalem and take Jerusalem back again from the Muslims. So when Salahuddin came to know of this, he put everything to the side. He put everything to the side and he focused all of his attention on Quds. That we need to protect Jerusalem. We cannot allow the Christians to take it again. So what did Salahuddin do? He ordered all of his soldiers that were stationed in other cities. You know, he had an army, and he had soldiers in this army stationed at different cities. So he ordered all of those soldiers, leave your cities. Leave your cities, leave your stations, and everyone come and unify and gather in Jerusalem, because we have to protect Jerusalem. That is the number one priority and the main objective. So Salahuddin's army, they came from the different places they were stationed, whether they were in this city or that city, they all came to Jerusalem, and they fortified the walls of Jerusalem very, very strongly. Now, as for Richard the Lionheart, he and his army, they're on their way to Jerusalem, right? They conquered a number of these cities on the coast. Now they're on their way to Jerusalem. Now, on his way to Jerusalem, Richard the Lionheart and his army, they passed first through the city of Ramla. And they found that the city of Ramla, the walls were already destroyed. They came to the city and they found the city does not have fortification. The walls are already destroyed. Why were the walls of Ramla destroyed? Even before Richard the Lionheart and his army got there. Because Salahuddin, when he ordered his soldiers to leave these cities, and Ramla was one of the cities, he ordered his soldiers to leave, to come to Jerusalem. When he ordered his soldiers to leave these cities, he told them as well to break the walls of the city. Salahuddin himself, he told his army, when you're leaving the city, break the walls of the city, destroy the walls of the city, so that even if the Crusaders come and they conquer those cities, they will not be able to benefit from the fortification themselves. They cannot use those cities themselves as a base, right? So Salahuddin told his soldiers, leave these different cities, leave Ramla, leave Lud, but first destroy the walls and then come to Jerusalem. So look at the strategic mind of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. He's thinking ahead to make sure that the enemy does not have the ability to strengthen itself any more than the strength that they already have, right? So Richard the Lionheart and his army, they came to Ramla, they found the walls of the city are already destroyed, and of course they took over Ramla without any resistance. Then they passed through the city of Lud, and it was the same thing. The walls were destroyed, and that was also by the instructions of Salahuddin. The walls were already destroyed. So Richard the Lionheart and his army, they took the city of Lud as well without any resistance. So Salahuddin and his army, they're all in Jerusalem. They're focused on protecting Jerusalem and preventing the forces of Richard the Lionheart from taking the city of Jerusalem. Also, while Richard the Lionheart's army was heading towards Al-Quds, while they were heading towards Jerusalem, Salahuddin, he would send small contingents of his army to disrupt them on the path, to make distractions for them and disruptions for them and obstacles for them on the path. And the Bedouin tribes of Philistine also helped, right? They caused disruption for Richard the Lionheart and his army on their way to Jerusalem. So by the time Richard the Lionheart and his army finally did reach outside the walls of Jerusalem, Richard the Lionheart and his army, they were pretty much worn down by this time with all of the obstacles that they had to face on the way. So now Richard the Lionheart, he's outside of Jerusalem. The city is very strongly fortified, and Salahuddin and his full army are inside the city. So Richard the Lionheart, before he makes any move, he analyzed the situation. Like, what can we do here? What steps can we take? What would be the best way to conquer the city? So he analyzed a number of different options, and in the end, Richard the Lionheart came to a conclusion regarding taking over Jerusalem and taking it away from Salahuddin. He came to a conclusion, and he announced this conclusion to his army. What was the conclusion that he came to after analyzing the whole situation? The conclusion that Richard the Lionheart came to was that the city of Jerusalem cannot be conquered while Salahuddin is still alive. As long as Salahuddin is alive, there's no way that we will be able to conquer the city. If it was someone else, then perhaps it would be possible, but not with Salahuddin. This was the conclusion that Richard the Lionheart came to. So he decided not to continue with the siege of Jerusalem. And of course, this decision, it caused a great dispute within the Crusader army. Because the Crusaders, this was the whole purpose of their crusade, to take Jerusalem, right? Yeah, they were taking other cities in Philistine as well, but the main objective was Jerusalem. So if they're going to leave without taking Jerusalem, they would feel that their whole objective has failed. So Richard the Lionheart, his decision not to continue with the siege of Jerusalem, it was met by a lot of dispute and disagreement within his own army, within the Crusader army, right? But Richard the Lionheart, he remained firm. He said, no, I know war. I have experience with war. I am an experienced military strategist. I've been through many wars before. I know that this is not possible. While Salahuddin is there with his army, we will not be able to take Jerusalem. And if we attempt to do so, we will just inflict heavy casualties and losses upon ourselves. So Richard was firm in his decision, and he retreated with his army. They went to Ramlah. They retreated with their army to Ramlah. But this disagreement amongst the Crusaders and amongst the Christians regarding Jerusalem, of course, it didn't end. Conrad of Montferrat, who was the head of the Christians of Sur, and remember last week we spoke about the Christians of Sur, how they had gathered in the city of Sur, which is also a coastal city, and they were the first ones who started the siege of Akka. The Christians of Sur, they started the siege of Akka, and then the Crusaders from Europe came to support them. But the siege of Akka was started actually by the Christians of Sur. And Conrad, he was the head of those Christians of Sur. So when he heard that Richard the Lionheart wants to abandon the plan to retake Jerusalem, he thought that this will be a disaster. He thought that if Richard the Lionheart has decided that he's not going to conquer Jerusalem, then that means eventually he's going to go back to Europe. Why is he going to stay in Philistine without conquering Jerusalem? If he has decided that it's not possible, it means he's going to go back to England. So Conrad feared that if Richard the Lionheart and his whole army, the army of England, if they go back to Europe, they go back to England, then Conrad felt that he would be left alone to face the wrath of Salahuddin. That Salahuddin, he would take revenge upon him, and he would not have the protection of Richard the Lionheart with him anymore. So Conrad felt scared for himself because of this situation. So before this could happen, Conrad decided to reach out to Salahuddin. He decided to reach out to Salahuddin to start secret negotiations with him without informing Richard the Lionheart. Conrad started these negotiations without informing Richard the Lionheart. And Conrad, he said to Salahuddin, he offered Salahuddin, he said, I will give you back Saida and Beirut. I will give you back the cities of Saida and Beirut, and I will go back to Sur myself. But what I need from you in return is I need a promise of safety. You know, that in the end you will not harm me and you will not execute me. So Salahuddin agreed. He said, okay, you give us back Saida, you give us back Beirut, you go back to Sur. I promise you I will give you safety, but one other condition that I impose, Salahuddin is telling him, one other condition that I impose is that all of the Muslim prisoners that you have in Sur, the Christians, they had a number of Muslim captives in the dungeons in Sur, right? So Salahuddin said, all of those captives, you must release them and you must free them, right? So while these negotiations were going on between Salahuddin and Conrad, and remember, Conrad did not inform Richard the Lionheart of these negotiations, but Richard the Lionheart, he came to know. He came to know that these negotiations are going on between Salahuddin and Conrad. So when Richard the Lionheart came to know about this, the disunity between the Christians, it grew even more, it increased even more. That look at these things are going on behind my back, and they're trying to make backdoor deals with Salahuddin. So Richard the Lionheart, he was very upset with this, and the disunity amongst the Crusaders and amongst the Christians, it grew even more. And this is actually exactly what Salahuddin wanted. The reason why he even agreed to negotiations with Conrad was because he wanted Richard the Lionheart to find out. And he knew that if Richard the Lionheart found out that Conrad had started these negotiations without even informing him, then this would cause great friction between Conrad and Richard the Lionheart. And then they'll start disputing with each other, they'll start fighting with each other. And the Christians, the Crusaders fighting amongst themselves, fighting with each other, this is good for the Muslims, alhamdulillah. Right? So this is what Salahuddin wanted. He wanted the Christians to start fighting with one another. So this was the plan of Salahuddin. But what happened? The Hashashin got involved. Remember the Hashashin, we spoke about them? The Batini Ismailis who used to go around assassinating people. They got involved in this and they actually set up an assassination attempt on Conrad and on Salahuddin. They attempted to assassinate Conrad and they also attempted to assassinate Salahuddin. They were successful in assassinating Conrad. They killed Conrad. But they were unsuccessful in assassinating Salahuddin. Alhamdulillah, they weren't able to assassinate Salahuddin. So where did the Hashashin get involved in? Where did they come into this? How did this happen, right? These Ismaili Batinis who were initially part of the Qaramita and the Fatimiyya, but that kingdom, that dynasty was long gone. But of course there were still remnants of the people from that sect, from the Ismailis. They were still around, even though they didn't have a dynasty and they were not organized like they used to be. So how did they get involved in this whole thing? And why did they try to assassinate Conrad? And why did they try to assassinate Salahuddin? And they were actually successful in assassinating Conrad. So who was behind this? Who hired these Hashashin to do this? Some historians say that Richard the Lionheart was behind it, right? Because of his dispute with Conrad. Some of them say that he was behind the assassination of Conrad and he is the one who hired these Hashashin to assassinate Conrad. But there's no definitive proof that Richard the Lionheart was behind this. So Allah knows best, right? But this is what happened. Conrad was assassinated in the middle of those negotiations. They also tried to assassinate Salahuddin, but they were unsuccessful in doing so. So now Salahuddin's plan, his plan to cause infighting amongst the Christians, amongst the Crusaders, this plan was ruined with the assassination of Conrad. And after that, more battles continued between Salahuddin's army and the army of Richard the Lionheart. So these battles continued. And more casualties continued to be inflicted upon the Crusader army. So Richard the Lionheart now, he's confused regarding what he should do now. What's the next step that he should take? He has already decided that he's not going to try to take over Jerusalem. He has already decided that that's an impossible task. So now he's confused. Should I stay in Palestine? Should I go back to England? He thinks that if he goes back to Europe, he will be considered a failure because he didn't conquer Jerusalem. And the whole purpose of this crusade, the main objective was to take Jerusalem. So if he goes back to England without having conquered Jerusalem, then he will be looked at as a failure. But then he thought, but if I stay here in Palestine, then what's the point of staying here? What's the point of staying here when I'm not going to be able to fulfill the main objective of why I came here for. I'm not going to be able to take Jerusalem, so why should I stay in Philistine? So he's thinking, should I stay in Philistine or should I go back to England? Right? He's weighing his options. And while he was still there in Philistine, he actually became very sick. He became very, very ill, close to death. So Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, his nemesis, his enemy, Salahuddin al-Ayyubi sent doctors and treatment to Richard the Lionheart. And some of the historians have actually criticized Salahuddin al-Ayyubi for doing this. Like, why would you send doctors to your enemy, the one who's trying to destroy you, the one who killed so many of your people and has taken so many of your cities? Why would you send doctors to him and treat him from his illness, right? So some of the historians actually criticize Salahuddin for this. But if you reflect upon it and if you look at it from a deeper perspective, you will understand Salahuddin's reasoning in why he wanted to keep Richard the Lionheart alive. The reason why he didn't want Richard the Lionheart to die was because Richard the Lionheart had already made it clear that he's not targeting Jerusalem anymore, that he's not going to try to take Jerusalem. So if Richard the Lionheart were to die, and then someone else became the leader of the Crusaders, it would be very likely that the new leader of the Crusaders would want to take over Jerusalem. He would want to make an attempt to conquer Jerusalem. So Salahuddin thought that it's better to have Richard the Lionheart in charge. Someone who doesn't want to take Jerusalem, it's better to have him as the leader of the Crusaders than having him replaced with someone else who will try to take Jerusalem. So look at the forward thinking of Salahuddin. He's ready to help his enemy because he knows that if his enemy dies, he may be replaced with an enemy that is even worse. So he's looking at it from what is, the lesser of the two evils in this situation. And he felt the lesser of the two evils in this situation would be Richard the Lionheart staying in his position as the leader of the Crusaders, right? So Alhamdulillah, Salahuddin, he sent his doctors, he sent treatment to Richard the Lionheart, and Richard the Lionheart, he was actually cured from this illness, right? His health was restored. And after this, he opened negotiations with Salahuddin again. He said, let's start negotiating again. So Salahuddin, once again, he sent his brother Adil to represent him in the negotiations. So Richard the Lionheart, in his negotiations, he said, okay, the main condition that we must insist upon in these negotiations is that you, Salahuddin, you must give Jerusalem to the Christians. You must give Jerusalem to the Christians, and the Muslims, we will allow them to maintain administration of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. So Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, it will remain under Muslim administration, and the Christians will not destroy it, or they will not, desecrate it or anything like that. The Muslims will be free to pray there, right? And they can have administration of Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa. But the city of Jerusalem as a whole, it will be given to the Christians. This is the first condition that Richard the Lionheart insisted upon in his negotiations with Adil, the brother of Salahuddin. So Adil, he sent this condition to Salahuddin that this is what Richard is asking for, and Salahuddin immediately he rejected it. He said, no, we can negotiate about other cities. Other cities we can negotiate temporarily. Even those negotiations are temporary. We're not going to agree to give you any city permanently. But for a period of time, as we agree upon on these treaties, whether it's 3 years or 5 years or 10 years or whatever, we can agree about other cities. We can negotiate other cities. We can concede control temporarily of other cities to you for the term of these treaties. But as for Jerusalem, never. Jerusalem is off limits, and it can never be taken except by blood. Right? We will never give up Jerusalem. The only way that you guys take Jerusalem again is if you take it by fighting. But we will never surrender Jerusalem. But Richard the Lionheart, he insisted on this condition. He said, the negotiations, it's a non-starter with us unless you agree to give us Jerusalem. That's our main objective. That's what we want. But Salahuddin, of course, he refused. He said, no way. I can never give you Jerusalem. That's off limits. So because both sides remained insistent, the negotiations fell apart. The negotiations fell apart, and Salahuddin, once again, he announced the continuation of jihad. Now around this same time, Richard the Lionheart received news from England that his brother John, His brother John has taken over the throne. He's taking advantage of the fact that Richard the Lionheart is not in England. So his brother John took over the throne and he announced himself the King of England. Right? He announced himself, I'm the new King of England, because his brother was not there. Right? So now Richard was very upset about this. His brother betrayed him in such a way. He's trying to steal his throne from him while Richard is in Philistine. So Richard the Lionheart, he decided he needs to quickly get back to England to take care of this situation. Right? He needs to save his throne. But before leaving Philistine, he decided to negotiate with Salahuddin one last time. And this time he was willing to make more concessions because he needed to get back to England quickly now. His main thing now, I need to get back to England, so I'll make the negotiations with Salahuddin and I'll give him what he wants. I will not insist upon taking Jerusalem for the Christians. So he started these negotiations again with Salahuddin, and he agreed that Jerusalem will remain with the Muslims. Jerusalem will remain with the Muslims, under control of the Muslims, but he made it a condition that Salahuddin and the Muslims should allow Christians to come into Jerusalem to make their Christian pilgrimage. Christians, they would go and visit Jerusalem. They consider it a holy city. They have the church of Sepulchre that is there, that they consider a very holy site, right? So one of the conditions that Richard the Lionheart made with Salahuddin is that, okay, Jerusalem is yours, but you have to allow the Christians who want to make pilgrimage to come into Jerusalem and make that pilgrimage. So Salahuddin, he agreed to this. He said, okay. And also from the conditions was that Richard the Lionheart and the Crusaders, they would have the coastal cities. Those coastal cities that they had conquered from Sur to Jaffa, that those will remain under Christian control. But of course, Salahuddin, he made it clear that this is a temporary treaty. Right? This is not permanent. We temporarily concede control of those cities to you for the term of this agreement. And those were those coastal cities all the way from Sur to Jaffa on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea with Philistine. And the term of this agreement was 3 years and 3 months. The term of this agreement was 3 years and 3 months. So Richard, from his end, he agreed that he would recognize Jerusalem, recognize Al-Quds as an Islamic city. Right? So these were the terms that were agreed upon, and Salahuddin and Richard the Lionheart came to this agreement that both sides accepted. And this treaty, it is known as Mu'ahada al-Ramla, the Treaty of Ramla, because Ramla is where the negotiations took place. Sulh al-Ramla or Mu'ahada al-Ramla. And that was done in the year 588 of the Hijrah, which corresponds to the year 1192 in the Gregorian calendar. That is when the Sulh al-Ramla or the Treaty of Ramla was ratified by Richard the Lionheart and Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. Inshallah, we'll stop there for tonight, bi'idhnillah, and inshallah next week we will continue with the history of the Holy Land, bi'idhnillah. جزاكم الله خيرا وبارك الله فيكم والله أعلم وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.